Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag.
Coming up next is the 106th episode of Between the Covers, an interview with Khi Nao about her latest poetry collection, Umbilical Hospital, and her short story collection, A Brief Alphabet of Torture. Some additional readings by Khi Nao, both prose poetry and poetry, will join work by Lenny Zumas, Carmen Maria Machado, Yun Song Kim, Therese Marie Mayet, and Micheline Aharonian Markham in the growing archive of bonus material at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. So do check this all out. And while there, consider supporting the show. Again, it's at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer, poet, artist, and filmmaker Khi Nao. Khi Nao is the author of the novellas Swans and Half Mourning and The Vanishing Point of Desire, the story collection Oh God, Your Babies Are So Delicious, the much beloved and critically acclaimed novel Fish in Exile from Coffeehouse Press, and the poetry collection The Old Philosopher, which won the Nightboat Books Prize for Poetry, and of which the poet C.D. Wright said, "We are no longer used to the heart's engine revving with such quiet, lonely, insistent, anatomical intensity." Khi now holds an MFA from Brown University, where she received the John Hawkes and Feldman Prizes in Fiction and the Kim Ann Arstark Memorial Award in Poetry. Khi Nao is here today on Between the Covers to talk about both fiction and poetry, her two latest publications, her story collection, A Brief Alphabet of Torture from the University of Alabama Press, winner of the Fiction Collective 2's Ronald Sukenik Innovative Fiction Prize, and the poetry collection Umbilical Hospital out from 1913 Press. Of her story collection, A Brief Alphabet of Torture, Michael Martone says, "These pieces are elaborate piecework, perforated, whip-stitched, and distressed field-dressed dissections of language. Tortured? Maybe, but lusciously junked and juxtaposed, turned inside out and every which way but. No, in every way they make way. These tales tax and tantalize, a taxidermy of turned transcendence." Of her poetry collection, Umbilical Hospital, Rae Armantrout says, "Imagine an entity composed of sheep, wheat, assholes, clitorises, stars. Why not? That would be this poem, this world, a perfectly recognizable post-human world which is also post-surreal. Khi Nao is making it new. No, she is doing the old job of making us see what's already here in a new way. We're already part of the bunny frog and the sheep machine, and we're feeling fine. This is bold, fresh, necessary work." Welcome to Between the Covers, Khi Nao.
Hi, David.
Hi. It's such an honor to have you here today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to start with your poetry collection, Umbilical Hospital, which I think you could consider an ekphrastic collection in the sense that it's in an ongoing engagement with a film by an avant-garde filmmaker and painter, Leslie Thornton. And the film's called Sheep Machine. And I noticed that your latest chapbook, God Expects You to Collaborate with Infinity, is also engaged with Sheep Machine. And your next book coming out later this year is also engaged with Sheet Machine and entitled Sheet Machine. So let's start with Sheet Machine. What is this film that is inspiring you to be engaged in various projects with?
Well, originally, I was in Leslie Thornton classroom, her narrative immersion class when I was a graduate student at Brown. It was my last year, and I waited a year to take her film course, and she was on sabbatical, and so when I wrote her and requested I could take her class, she said yes, and so during one of her classroom meetings, she showed me her films, her binoculated, digitally manipulated films, and I was fascinated, and I approached her and said, I would like to study one of your films, one of your binocular films. She did a series on different animals like spiders and sheep, and so I said, I'm going to study it frame by frame. She said, you're insane. I think I didn't understand quite the degree of what a frame by frame and its level of insanity. So when I took screenshots of each frame, I realized that for me to study 1 minute of her film would take me a year, and the manuscript would be so long. So I wrote like maybe 100,000 words of a poetic study of her work. I thought I'll break it down to like 10 seconds per 3 months or something like that. It takes a long time because there's like 60 frames within like a second, or sometimes at 30 frames per second. That's 30 frames in 1 second, and then some of them so I end up with a lot of frames. And
are you speaking now specifically about your forthcoming book, Sheet Machine, as the forum?
No, my chapbook, God Expects You to Collaborate with Infinity, was part of that long fabric of studying the whole work frames. I produced so much work, and to put it in one, and so I approached the editing methods 3 different ways. I took one long fabric of the manuscripts and I edited for one manuscript. So when it reached 60 pages or something, I stopped the editing process, and that became the Umbilical collection. And then I wanted a chapbook out of it, so someone was approached me and said, we wanted to create a chapbook on a particular animal. And I said, well, I've been studying sheep for months, for years. And so I'm just going to take another part of the manuscript that I've been writing for so long. I'm going to edit that for the chapbook. And then Sheet Machine, I did it a complete different. They're like 2 different beasts, but of the same manuscript, but of the same. It reminds me of like a long fabric, and you just make different shirts and skirts and dresses out of them. And so each book are different garments of perception that I've composed or restitched or stitched together. And so each manuscript has a particular aesthetic. So Umbilical Hospital will be read completely different than Sheet Machine. Mm-hmm. And Sheet Machine is more focus based on I call it more of like poetic essay. There's a lot of research I went into. I research about sheep, I research about wool, I research about philosophers, and so it's embedded and stitched with different nonfiction impulses that I've garnered across time. But Umbilical Hospital, I did no research. It was just based on what I observed from the screenshots of Leslie Thornton's Sheet Machine, and became very weird the editing process is very weird. The whole thing feels very weird.
Yeah.
And the titles that are birthed from the manuscript feels really weird because Sheep Machine doesn't have any titles. It's just one long essayish poetic draw. But Umbilical Hospital each poem has its own title.
Yeah.
Does that explain?
That's very well explained. And you've said before about the film, about Leslie Thornton's film, that the sheep do nothing but move around a digital canvas eating grass. And then you say about your own work in relationship to these sheep that the concept is boring, but the actual art of writing it is not. And boredom has come up a lot in interviews with you before. When asked what books you love, you often will name books where you describe one of their aspects as being boring. And you brought up Jelinek Lust, that you say you love but also find boring, for instance. And you've talked about the importance of showing boring things in art, the importance of boredom in work. So when you say that the concept of the book, in this case, Umbilical Hospital, is boring, I almost feel like you're paying a compliment in a way, that you're not describing a flaw. But I would love just to hear more about either the value of boredom or the attraction to boredom as part of an aesthetic.
I think boredom is a sustained state of awareness, but it makes us feel jittery. I get bored easily, but when I say I get bored easily, it often means that I'm not engaged enough. But when I talk about a book that's boring, I was thinking more from the reader's or the viewer's perspective of what they might respond or the perception of my experience would be. So there's an element of harsh judgment in it, but it's also trying to give viewers or readers warning ahead that they might fall asleep in engaging with something that is very deep and retrospective. And I think those demand so much attention that people have to sort of drop out of reality in order to continually be embraced by it. I think sometimes things that are hyper entertaining makes you really awake, but then you forget everything. You forget that you were there. You forget that you even read that manuscript or watched that film. So I believe in a form of like hyper boredom or some sort of things that are not that exciting on first sight, but as you dive deeper and deeper into the work, its engagement is switched from boredom to awareness. And I also was influenced by a filmmaker. He's, I think, Iranian. He did the ABC Africa. I'm not very good with name. But basically he says he likes films that make him fall asleep because they don't attack the viewers with and make you feel cheated later because you feel like your time had been robbed but you didn't know you've been robbed. And I think when I tell people that certain works are boring, is because I don't want them to feel like they've been robbed in any way. And I mean robbed as in time, which is the most a valuable resource that we have besides money. But I believe in that kind of resource, in channeling that resource and not being, as the filmmaker said, abducted and then cheated out of our time.
Yeah.
So I give people warning. I also think like what I do like on a daily basis is very boring. You know, like you sit down, you write, or I cook for like 3 hours, or I walk for like 10, and there's really nothing that it's exciting. You know, I'm not at a party. I'm not.
The poems in Umbilical Hospital are very far from boring, which people are going to hear soon. But there is a way there's a certain cycling through or rumination that happens with a very limited set of images. I haven't seen the film, so I don't know how captivating the film is compared to the poems. But in the Umbilical Hospital collection, we have these images that keep reoccurring: sheep, wheat, windmills, and stones, among others, that we see in new and strange and surprising configurations as we go through. And I know that repetition and boredom are not necessarily related. Sometimes repetition causes the opposite. It can be incantatory and create excitement or deepen engagement. But I wondered if maybe you could speak a little bit about the repetition. Is that just a product of the engagement with the limited images in the film?
Yes, it's a result of, like, that's what you see. There's just nothing. It's just sheep and then wheat of grass, just the wind blowing it from time to time. And then maybe when the manipulation takes place, it replaces these images in the second binocular. And so you get to see the left or the right side, and then you see that switch. But it's only temporary. It shifts back to boredom again, to what you've seen before. And so it forces me to see deeper into the image. And when I could not see the deepness of it, I just state the obvious. When you state the obvious, that's all you see is just sheep, wheat.
Right. And
then
windmills.
sometimes, like when the sheep gets close and they turn their body around, you get to see the asshole. And so what do? You just state the obvious. So I'm like, and I didn't intend on like studying sheep's asshole, but or their butt, but and it becomes almost like as if they don't possess those kind of body parts. It becomes like almost like part of the machination of the landscape.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you depict something that blends in with the landscape, and yet you still have to identify it as something that's recognizable by our human experiences? So I try to get out of those realms as much as possible. But I when I said it was conceptually boring, it's true. I mean, it's just, there is nothing that why would you want to study? Like, I think Lydia Davids, she studied cows, like real cows, walking across the landscape. At one point, one of her manuscripts was born from that. But at least they're alive. These are like digitally moving, sheep moving across landscapes. So even if I want to engage with the sheep, I couldn't even engage. At least she could walk out the door and attack them or run after them or run a kite around them and see if she can get them to engage with her. But I couldn't get these sheep to engage with me, even if like I blew a tornado with my mouth across my computer. And so I had to figure out a way to be with it. And when I'm in the present moment, just writing as I observe for 10 minutes that I devoted to observing, because it was so beautiful. It was also very, I breathed for the first time in my life when I did these ekphrastic studies, and it felt so empowering. Like the moment spoke louder than what I thought the moment might be or could be, or how it alters me. And so 10 minutes of my life devoted to this moment, and it felt very sacred to me. And I produced work that I sort of, and when I wrote, I didn't read from the one yesterday or the one before. I just wrote and I just abandoned it. And then when I sat down to like edit, I was like, wow, I I did observe digitally. And I think it benefited me the most. It was more for me than for the readers. And I thought the reader wouldn't get much out of it because since it was for me.
Yeah.
And
But you were wrong about that.
I hope I'm wrong.
Well, this would be, I would love for the listeners to hear some of the poems before we talk any more about the collection.
The night cleans her black tongue with the sleeves of my heart. The night cleans her black tongue with the sleeves of my heart, licking the darkness here and there. My soul like a dog upon my soul. The visitation takes place. Sheep pile on the grass like blonde garbage bags. Any moment to be toppled over at any moment. The wind greets the afternoon. Shadows cast on the cosmic walls. Tiny specter of uniformity. Tiny specter of death. I like to open my eyes and ears to those swollen afternoon. I would like this, and then I would like the sheep to spill their guts. I want this to continue on. The next poem is called The Battle of the Gaze. Third leg must be invisible. There is no other way. Tribotic windmill with alien face wears a hay mask. Stands there before the viewers, waiting for the battle of the gaze. Is there simile in this discontinuity between man and man's perception of reality? Surely all the sheep bending over the grass aren't just performing a purely cryonic task of facial burial, the funeral eating task, and so on and so forth. And the last poem is on page 39. It's called This is the Edge. This is the edge. To love the earth more than to love the edge of sleep, and to love each equal and distant is to love certainty more than to love the surrendering of a certainty. This is the edge. The windmill, dome-shaped now, more now than ever, has turned its back toward residuum. What have you turned your back on lately? What have you betrayed?
We've been listening to Khi Nao read poems from her collection, Umbilical Hospital. So you studied with C.D. Wright and Forrest Gander at Brown. Is that right?
I studied with C.D. Wright, but Forrest Gander, I became more engaged with him after Brown. But I also was with him in one of the classes that C.D. and Forrest taught. And they went to the cemetery to visit Robert Keeley at his grave, I think.
Robert Creeley?
Yeah, Robert Creeley. And so I became more engaged with him after I graduated. But I always view them as like one person. So,
Are there any things that either of them or both of them together imparted to you that you still hear in your ear in terms of how you approach poetry?
Well, with Forrest, when I meet him, like over pizza or tequila. I don't know if it's tequila. It's a mixed drink. It has tequila in it, but I couldn't remember the name of it. But he's really knowledgeable about like Spanish drinks or drinks that are Spanish influence. With Forrest, because his present being with him, his present. He's still alive, and so it dominates my consciousness in a non-literary way. So the way I experience him as a poetic form in person, I cannot state it in words at this moment. However, with C.D. Wright, whenever I walk, when I'm doing my long 16-mile walk in Vegas or in Henderson, sometimes I hear her voices. Like sometimes she'll give me like advices on life, and those conversations I do record in my consciousness. She says one of the things that I particularly remember about C.D. Wright is how compassionate she was, or she still is in my consciousness, or when I'm completely aware of her presence during one of my walks. When I took a course with C.D. Wright on a workshop, my grammar sometimes is difficult for me, and so it's hard to break certain patterns, certain mistakes that you make across time. And so CD, instead of berating me for my grammatical mistakes, she would say, it's hard to break a pattern that you've developed over time, and she just sort of was very compassionate. She didn't try to correct me. She didn't try to impose her grammatical structure on me. She just sort of acknowledged that is when we develop a particular habit, we become so used to it, and it's hard to change. She just realized the humanity in all of us. And so having taken her workshop and see how compassionate and how kind she was to me in class, every time when I feel harsh toward me or toward anyone, I feel her presence and feel her influence, and it makes me want to be compassionate, like the way she has been towards me. Or she also gives really good hugs, like not those fake A-frame hugs. She kind of give you a full hug, like she meant it, not like I'm not afraid of your skin or of a certain what we see in our culture lately, where everyone is afraid to express their humanity because they are afraid of a lawsuit or something. And I felt like she just knew how to navigate the politics of modern time and still preserve her humanity. And I would like to be able to do that for others as well, and for myself as well.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think of when I think of Forrest Gander, which is somewhat obvious, is that he engages very seriously with eco-poetics. And it makes me think of that phrase that Rae Armantrout uses in the blurb for your book, that she describes your book as post-human. And I wondered what that meant to you when she said that your work was post-human, and if you agreed, and if so, and how do you see that as a descriptor of it?
Well, I don't know if I want to disagree with her, even if I do disagree with her. And I don't know if disagreement is the right atmospheric response to that. I just know that when I study sheet machine, it's so unworldly. Like, I think Leslie Thornton's work is very post-human. Like, what she does is just really out there. She's just really wild in her imaginative faculty. And when I asked her, where do you get your ideas? And she said, well, you know what? I don't follow other people's films making. I don't go and read a bunch of these other people's work. I just keep to myself. And so she just, I think her lack of exposure to her peers in her community may have shaped her post-human reality. For me, I'm fully engaged in our time. I converse with and I watch a lot of films, and I try to read my peers' work whenever I can. I don't believe that what I read will make things post-human or anything. It just so happened that this manuscript is an observation of what I was studying. So it's an observation, and when you observe, it is what it is. So if it's post-human, then it is.
Right.
And what is post-human? It's like when everyone no human ever exists, and it's just pro form of like a very hyper form of reverse dinosaurs. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like post-human is it's a word that you can use. I think, like the word God. Like it's.
Well, she used it along with Bunny Frog and Sheep Machine, which also have these strange resonances too, I think.
Yeah, and when you just juxtapose all that together, I feel like when a word has a congregation of other words that sort of don't belong together in a group, and when they coexist together like that, I think it's to exude a particular kind of, or to say, like you're existing in a weird world without saying the word weird. Mm-hmm. And so, and post-human sort of give that connotation. I don't know how I feel about like umbilical hospital as post-human. Like, I don't even know what the manuscript is about now. I edited Umbilical Hospital when I was in a hospital, so it was a blur. It was like, I need to send it to the editor soon. I need to be out in the world, and so I didn't really sat down to read what I edited. And so now that I had like that moment where I was just reading my manuscript, what I felt like for the first time, it's another. I think it's a work that I can't memorize. Mm-hmm. Like there's certain poetry collection where you just read a poem and then you feel like you can have it down in your consciousness. And I feel like Umbilical Hospital is relief from that position. It doesn't occupy me in the same way. And I feel like a poem could replace itself with another poem now that I experience it.
With some distance.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that I didn't mention when I was introducing you is that you're an interviewer of writers yourself. You've interviewed tons of great writers, and you conduct some of the strangest interviews I've come across, and I'm always looking forward to reading who you're interviewing. Your questions have included, would you cross a river for someone you don't love? Do you like drawstring pants, and have you ever worn them while writing haiku? And I used to think white people smell like butter. What do you think white people smell like? So I just want to ask you a couple of your own questions as part of this interview. To begin with, is there a poet, writer, or philosopher, dead or alive, that you would love to take a shower with non-sexually?
Well, karma works wonderful. Really. And wow, now that I've been asked by my own question.
Well, you can think about it if you want to answer later, too.
Yeah, let me think about it. That's a really hard one.
Yeah.
That's a really hard one.
Yeah.
I'm so glad I asked someone else, though.
Okay, so one question that you've called one of your standard questions is asking guests to break down a poem for you, to tell you where they were when they wrote it, to expound on the references that may not be obvious to readers, to talk about any research that occurred, and to recall, if possible, what they were eating when they wrote it. So is there a poem in Umbilical Hospital that maybe you could unpack those invisible aspects to?
Oh, that's hard because I did it in one long manuscript and I took out to edit.
Oh, so that you might not have an individual memory with
Yeah,
that
I
poem.
don't have an individual because they didn't have titles. Today I'm going to observe the screenshot and then I'm just going to data dump that observation into a file.
Yep.
And then it will be like 100,000 words. And then when I edit, I'm like, oh, this look like it has a shape of that particular poem. So I'm going to extract that. And
well, how about I have a couple others I'd love for people to hear.
okay.
And if any, no pressure, but if any thoughts come when you read it about any associations you have with the poem that aren't in the poem, maybe you can share them afterwards. So I was hoping you might read God Has an Archive of Cancer Cells and then Sonic Titillation.
From Umbilical Hospital, God has an archive of cancer cells. God has an archive of cancer cells he uses on humans when he is bored. Is he bored here, inviting a skeleton to dine on the pastoral table of grass? We bite and remove the horseshoe-shaped lips and kiss the engine of melancholy away. We are certain we have been cheated out of 4.3 years of our lives. We talk about dividing our flesh before releasing our breath and evacuating our blood. But God is busy escorting a flurry of sheep towards a moistureless river, where the sheep take small drinks of air and collapse when a mirage of thirst sweeps across the landscape. Sonic titillation. Raining doubt, raining sheep, raining twirls of memory. So an arc of wheat hovers over the bodice of sheep like a crown, and then the voluptuous asshole and its voluptuous clitoris gain some suspended gravitational momentum. Such are the eyes of the silenced bunny frog. Doom for sonic titillation. We are here and we are clueless about wheat-shaped eyes and eyelashes with angelic hovering crowns. And so we rotate our clitorises in circles, maybe even in semi-dictatorial circles. Our pleasure is not a clock. I don't remember how this poem is born, other than that I just remember observing it. And that's how they are born.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that's part of the post-human aspect.
Yeah.
The way in which there's not this connection to the memory of its creation.
Yeah, I just remember that I took a screenshot. I take like 100 at a time. And then I go down the list and like today I'm going to study like 5 of them.
Mm-hmm.
Or if another day I would do 10. And then once that I don't reread my work. I don't reread to see, okay, this makes any sense. I just observe and then write down my observations, put it into a file, stash it away, and then I continue on my day as if I've never done that before. And the next day I'll do it. And I just repeat. I feel like it's like taking a shower in the same shower stall for like 20 years. And then they said, can you tell in 1987 what was your shower like in that shower stall?
Right.
I would say I took a shower.
Yeah.
And water came down on me, and maybe some soap that I use, but I wouldn't be able to tell you. I think rituals sort of obliterates our consciousness and allow the intellectual consequences to unfold without memory. So. I don't know if that's post-human or it's just that in order to exist, you don't have to be human anymore. Mm-hmm. You can be a system of reality that observes, that collect, that stash data away, and then you're there, and then you're gone.
Well, as a way to transition from a discussion of your most recent poetry to the story collection, A Brief Alphabet of Torture, I'd love to talk about what Khi Nao is foregrounded versus another. What part of you comes forth more when you're writing in sentences versus in lines? Do you have any sense of, systems of reality that come to the forefront more when you're writing prose?
When I write, my muse would arrive, and it often arrived so fast. So I would drop everything to attend to that muse. I might be walking for 5 minutes and suddenly it came to me. So I would stand in the middle of the street. I would type out everything that came to me in a rush, and then I move on. And I do that with longer pieces as well, where it came to me and I would be writing for like 8 hours straight to complete like a 10-page short story. And that's how they're born. Then I wouldn't read them. I just stash them away until someone requests for like a short story, and then I pull them out, and I'm like, I might edit like one word, and then I send them out into the world.
Wow.
So I do very little editing.
But I would imagine, maybe I'm wrong, but I'd imagine like Fish in Exile, for instance, would be edited as a novel.
It was heavily edited, but by other people. Mm-hmm. It went through 3 editors. Like 2 of my editors, 2 other people edited first before it came into the hands of Coffee House Press, and Coffee House Press also edited. And I agreed to about 95% of their editing process. I'm like, oh yeah, that works. I have no problem. Once I get the energy of the piece, the atmospheric condition of the manuscript, its protagonist's journey, anything that like minor either changes in grammar or a few sentences here and there, I feel like those changes are more or less like, like you take a vacuum cleaner and you make sure that all the things, but you don't change the shape of the room or the way it's presented. To me, I feel the editing process is just, it doesn't violate the manuscript's original energy or spirit. And so when I took a course with Talia Field in her fiction class the first time, it was the first time I ever took a workshop. I've never taken a writing course before, so I was like completely ambushed by her presence. I was like, this is what fiction workshop is like, and she encouraged us to produce. Like we I think at one point we were like, there was like 150 pages to 180 pages per week worth of
wow,
like critiquing other people writing. And I'm like, oh my God. It's like, it was insane. But it was good insanity, I think. Other students didn't feel the same way, but I thought it was good. And she said, when you edit your work, I don't want you to just remove a sentence here and there, Like it's basically nitpicking. she wants you to do, when you edit, you really edit. Like you change the shape and the form and the atmosphere of the piece completely and utterly. And that kind of editing is very difficult. When I do edit, I would write a new piece. Basically, so I took the same manuscript and I turn it 180 degrees, and it's completely, you maybe recognize a few words from the original manuscript, but the tone, the energy, the atmosphere of the piece had a complete changeover. And so that's how I edit. And that's how I was able to produce like new work, is because I don't recycle the own work. I take what I feel like is not working in that piece, and I'm going to try to put it in a new form. And so that's how I value, or how I navigate through, or how I structure my own editing process.
Yeah.
It's not for everyone. Some people just like cleaning in sentences and making it really perfect and move on to the next sentence and make sure that on a microscopic level it's completely clean with like what is it those surgeons use when, or culinary artists use with a tweezer. They just go and they just pick one strand of garlic that's the size of like an eyelash, and they move it on top of like a very well curated tofu, and so you get to see how that one strand of garlic is operating on that tablet of tofu. But for me, I just like take a hammer to the tofu and I smash it, and it flattens, and you do not know where even the strand of that garlic even exists, and if it flew away because the impact was too heavy. And that's how I edit. It's not for everyone. The hammer method versus the tweezer.
Hammer tofu method.
Yeah.
Could you read for us I Ask the Sentence?
Yes.
In the story collection?
Actually, I wrote like 3 or 4 pages of that, and then I submitted to Noon. Mm-hmm. And so Diane William actually edited this piece.
Oh, okay.
I Asked the Sentence.
It's an unusual piece then in that
yes.
sense.
It's very well edited by Diane Williams. She's an amazing editor. I don't know how she does it.
I love that magazine.
Yeah, and she does Noon, and she edits it. She's one of those people that put a hammer. She doesn't, I mean, she does the tweezer method, but it's after
the hammer? After
the hammer that she's like, okay, let's go find that strand of garlic, and then let's put it back on. But the hammer goes first. I asked the sentence. I asked the sentence to move across the carpet floor. I asked it to not drag its paragraphical legs while doing so. I asked it not to be lonely, not to have ethical issues with women with menstrual cramps or periods and whatnot. I asked the sentence to conduct itself in a way that does not deny the social conditions of other sentences, that does not make any sentence feel left out or suicidal. I asked the sentence to be chivalrous, to open semantic doors for women, and not to treat children as linguistic concubines for imperial expansion. I asked the sentence not to open fire on other sentence. I asked the sentence to be self-reliant, to use itself as a mirror for narcissistic reasons, and not to ask other sentences for monetary support. I asked the sentence not to hypnotize other sentences so that they don't become organ donors to objects, nouns, pronouns, and indirect objects. I ask the sentence not to be an alcoholic, not to inebriate streams of consciousness, the passive voice, CD right. I ask the sentence to be reasonable in a Haitian a ransom. Just 5 more sentences, and I will let your mother, the paragraph, go. I ask the sentence not to leave her semicolon inside a hot van in the middle of the summer, and to leave the Budapest train station, but never to walk 105 miles to the border of Austria. I ask the sentence not to write that sentence, that sentence, the one where it has too much hyper masculinity in it, the one with the toilet lit up, that one. I ask the sentence to please marry Gary Lutz.
We've been listening to Khi Nao read from her story collection, A Brief Alphabet of Torture. Well, Gary Lutz is an interesting way to end a piece on a sentence. Is he a tweezer aficionado, do you think, in his sentences?
I don't know his method of editing. I just know that he wrote this piece called "The Sentence is a Lonely Place to Be."
It's one of my favorite pieces,
It's
actually.
one of my favorite as well.
And he wrote a more recent one about the paragraph.
Really?
Yeah, in 3 a.m. magazine. It's similar. It's like a kindred piece to it.
Yeah, but I better read that one too.
Yeah.
And so when I read that, I remember to reference him. So it's an acknowledgement to having read his piece called "The Sentence is a Lonely Place to Be."
Yeah. Well, when asked about the origins of this collection, you've said it is a book born primarily from semi-intense meditation on torture and comprised of many divisions of feminine affliction and ontological wretchedness. The collection is primarily violent, with some sections devoted to existential elegance and eroticism. So can you speak to what prompted this semi-intense meditation on torture?
Well, I was collaborating with another writer. She was at that time a PhD student at Brown, I think in comparative literature. And she says that she's a really good teacher, and I truly believe she is. And so she loves giving student assignments and prompts to get them to write. And so part of our collaborative effort was to produce a manuscript, a quasi or almost a manuscript together. We were just going to write. And so she assigned me the torture, both of us torture assignments, write about torture. It didn't appeal to me immediately. But since I was participating with her and we were collaborating together, I didn't want to deny myself the opportunity to explore something that was very uncomfortable for me and something that I've never done before. I wrote difficult pieces before, but they were born out of the need to, when the piece came to me, not because I sought a particular kind of method or subject out. And so when she suggested, I felt like a deer, with the headlight. I was just completely blinded by my own discomfort. But I got to it because we gave each other like a window in which we supposed to submit the piece. And I was committed to doing it and doing it well. And so the first part of the time I went and I did research. I researched on all the different types of torture. And some of them, I don't know if I wanted to mirror it. So I was just studying my consciousness, and I was like, what are some of the torture forms that I felt like that can be explored? And so I sat down, and each piece came, like each week we submit a piece. She didn't submit, but I end up doing about a manuscript worth of submission for our collaboration. And so it saddened me that I didn't get an opportunity to see her version of what constitutes torture. But my commitment to it produces this manuscript. And so it was divided into, originally it was just one large manuscript, and I felt like maybe it may have been too much. So I split it. Half of it, some of it went into the old philosopher. So,
So these really are pieces that are, you've called yourself an eco-writer, and that you recycle your writing. And I love that idea of the garment or the fragment from a fabric. And these really are pieces that are being cut from like one long scroll.
Yeah,
in a way.
It's basically
That become different books.
Yeah, I was just like, I sit down, and then people give me certain assignment, or I give myself assignment. I do a whole bunch. Like, they come at once. They don't just like, oh, okay, I'll sit down and I'll write. I have different writing rituals, and part of those rituals that I was in, I just produced when I was called to produce. I sat down and I wrote, and I didn't look at them for the longest time. And then when like I need to submit for a manuscript or someone asks for it, I'm like, okay, I'll just go through my hard drive, and I'm like, okay, this looked like a piece that could belong there. And when I submitted to a night boat, the collection, there were three poetry manuscript that I took apart, and I just like, okay, I'll just try to mix and match you. And so I just took one manuscript from here and there, and I composed them to one. And once they, I just don't know how they receive, like at least I give people like sample bites of each. And then once that manuscript is accepted, then I'm like, okay, I'll bring back the original. But because Night Boat accepted the first version of it, it couldn't go into a brief alphabet of torture. So I took other pieces that I've done in the past and combined with the a brief alphabet of torture.
Well, and we've talked a little about, I think the ways in which your different poetry projects right now are connected is more obvious, but your prose, as you're alluding to, is interrelated too. And you've said about A Brief Alphabet of Torture, despite being a collection of short stories, it's not a departure from my novel. It shouldn't be seen as a stranger, but rather a sibling, like a half-sister or an older sister of Fish in Exile. And you've talked about writing Fish in Exile while trapped in an abusive relationship, which made me wonder, since these books are siblings, if your meditation on torture was also in some ways a meditation on the torture of being trapped in an abusive relationship. It's more obvious in Fish in Exile, but hearing you talk about the collection, it sounds like maybe it isn't related to that experience at all.
I wanted to devote a manuscript to what happened to me when I was in that relationship, when I was at Brown and writing Fish in Exile. A lot of those stories haven't been born yet. And when I was thinking of torture, I was thinking more like within the political realm, because my collaborator, she was very much into protests. So I did in protest in conjunction with torture. So I was doing a research with a slight angle, and so I wasn't thinking of my own personal narrative. And now, since I have quite a few manuscripts that are memoir based, I want to go back and explore that abusive relationship from being trapped there. And I wanted, I didn't, because I was so close to it, I didn't feel like I was ready to write about it. I think I need sort of some distance, and now I have distance from my past. I feel like I can tackle it. I don't know if it would be torture based, but I think it would be like experience based, like what to avoid. It's like certain signs in your life, and it tells you what to do, and then you just don't heed it or follow it. I think, I think with distance, I don't think it will become a torture, a document. I think it will become something else.
You said that you had to disguise your own voice in Fish in Exile because your lover was reading it as you wrote it, and that it was, in a way, speaking of politics and torture, in a way it was like writing under fascism or communism. Everything had to be encoded and subtextual. And it reminded me of this paragraph in Fish in Exile that I'm just going to read that feels like a nod. At least I imagine that this is one of those coded places where you say, you don't want happiness as a lover. It's just a temporary lover. There are knives behind that joyous face. You can't trust happiness to treat you right. Happiness sometimes walks out on you in the middle of a conversation. Happiness is rude at times. But pain is reliable. Won't walk out on you that way. Never would. You may never have a lover like this again. So you dress your pain up so it won't be recognized by anyone. You camouflage it with accessory personalities. You don't want just anybody to have a hand on your pain to caress its inner thighs. You know that would be a violation, and you must protect your lover. You must protect your pain. You think it's all you have. So if I understand you correctly, that phenomenon isn't really part of this collection of A Brief Alphabet of Torture, this encoded voice.
I actually wrote that the day or a few days after she left my apartment in Providence. I actually sat down and I just remember writing that piece because I was trying to finish editing Fish in Exile. And I remember writing that very well. And I remember just like revisiting all the narrations that I experienced with my own experience when I was in that relationship, and that came. She didn't get to see that version. She saw the version that I sent for workshop at Brown when I was in Talia's class when we were submit our large project at the end. So I submitted Fish in Exile, but it was half of the manuscript. It was when. So I took that the summer when she left, to complete the manuscript, because then it has a voice that it could be of its own. I didn't realize that I was encoding it while I was doing it, but in retrospect, I realized, I need to clothe myself. I remember having a conversation with my friend Joe then, and I said, my family, we escaped communism, but I found communism in a relationship.
Yeah.
And so in the romantic relationship. And so, and he just like, he knew what I was talking about. And since he was, helped me a large part in how to leave that relationship and how to, he helped me a lot, actually. And so I'm very grateful for his protection. So yeah, you were very astute to recognize that
passage.
That passage actually came from being in that abusive relationship. It came all at once. It was just like I wrote that within like 15 minutes, and then it needed to be in Fish in Exile, but I just didn't know where then. And eventually, it found its home somewhere in the manuscript.
Yeah. In case you just tuned in, You're listening to Between the Covers, and we're talking today to the poet and writer Khi Nao. I wanted to ask you about both the role of sex and genitals, for that matter, in your work, and what sort of aesthetic or effect you're looking for in them, because we get penises and clitorises. In Umbilical Hospital, we explore the superpowers of the clitoris. In A Brief Alphabet of Torture, some of the most difficult to read torture is focused on the genitals. But either way, in much of your work, we get sex and the description of genitals foregrounded in an unsentimental way that makes penises and clitorises almost feel like strange creatures, like they're defamiliarized creatures on each person's body almost. But I would love to hear you talk a little bit about it, because you return to them, to the things that don't get spoken, and speak them.
I think the reason why I'm able to write them so easily then is because I don't view them as like body parts. They're just like a doorknob, or like like a French toast or something like that. They exist. They're out there, but I don't associate. This for some reason in my consciousness, I deassociate words with those words, genitals with just like regular objects that you find around the home, like a coffee mug, a telephone, even just a toothbrush. So because I don't view them as body parts, it gave me a lot of freedom just to write them. And when I write them, and since I don't really reread my work that often, I don't have an emotional connection with them or a sexual connection with them until other people approach me and say, wow, your work is really sexual. And then I'm like, I guess, then I realize that they are sexual, but like, what am I to do? They exist in the world.
Right.
And so the viewers are making me aware of my words or my word choices. And now when I write, I hesitate now. I'm less likely to, because they are becoming body parts now for me. I view them now as like actually genitals as genitals and not doorknobs or a swirly chair. I've become so self-conscious that I hesitate to use them now. So the manuscript that I'm writing more do not have those words so much. Like the current one that I'm working on, I think they almost are non-existent.
Interesting.
So, and now when I read them, I feel very, very self-conscious. I feel like I feel very naked now. I didn't realize how provocative they are. When I wrote them, they were just like manuscripts that needed to be born from my imaginative bank. I was just like pulling things out because they need to exist away from my imagination, and out of my imagination, I would have all these creative energy, and they need to come out in the world, and so I let them. And then when they are published, I'm like, well, they need to be out in the world, and so they are published. But yeah, now I feel incredibly shy about those words. And
Do you know why? Why that changed?
I think the memoir that I was writing addresses some of the deepest, most terrifying issues of my past. And because I dealt with them instead of bury them, instead of like abandoning them in some sort of post-structuralist style, I've been liberated from my own past. So because I'm liberated in that fashion, I feel incredibly cautious.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just, like, I think the part of me that value a particular kind of tenderness, devoid of particular sexuality, has been born. And I want to embrace that part of me that doesn't include sex writing in it. It's kind of strange. It's like it works really well for me in the past, and now I don't know if it works very well now.
Is it weird now to read those pieces?
Yes.
Out loud? Because I was going to suggest another one, but now I'm like, well, maybe we shouldn't have you read another one of those.
Well, I don't. I'm completely more aware that I'm reading them, and I do read them, but I don't have the same response to them like in the past, where it's just like nonchalant. Oh, it's just there. Now I'm just like, I feel more shy about reading them. But I'm not completely a nun.
Right.
Not yet.
Not yet. You're moving that way, though.
Not yet. Yeah, like certain sections in Fish in Exile, for instance. In the past, I would just read them and then I just like there. And now I'm like, oh my God, I wrote that.
Huh. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the body and bodily functions also, including sexual function, because we get a lot of food and we get a lot of cooking, we get a lot of bodily functions and odors, and we also get a lot of animals and sea creatures in the presence of nature, but not nature as this friendly, soft thing sometimes, but also nature as maybe less benevolent. And all of it has this sort of elemental, primal quality to it, where the personal narrative of like the human characters is only one small factor creating the story. I mean, even like a person's genitals feel like they're creating the story independently of the person. And I wondered, when you were talking about how processing your past, I don't know what you're writing about explicitly in the memoir, but you've talked about your family crossing the sea and about to escape Vietnam. And in an interview about Fish in Exile, you said, "My family spent 3 days and 3 nights inside of a tiny boat with 30 other people. Feces and vomit and seawater were up to my waist. Inside that boat, I smelled everything primal." And I don't want to be like too reductive, and I don't mean this to be like psychoanalytic, but you've connected this experience to the way you portrayed the ocean, for instance, in the Fish in Exile. But I wondered if you felt like this moment that you described in that interview in some way informs your aesthetics or your thematics in a larger sense.
It's really hard to detach myself from that experience. I think when you are a child, like when I was a child in that boat, and when you experiences feces and vomit, it just, it leaves a very, you can't ever wipe that. No matter how many times you wipe your counters or clean your bed sheets, it just taint your memory. I don't know how to express. I think what happened I don't know what author, is it Flannery O'Connor or another writer, but it says like what happened in your childhood shapes your entire whole adulthood life for the rest of your life. I feel like that moment on that boat dictate about 90% of my existence. I have a particular kind of repulsion to feces that I don't know how to write it out of my system. But I've written about them. It's just a very hard. I'm still dealing with them, with that scene in which I was on that boat with my parents, and I remember the sea, and for the longest time I was pulled by the sea. That's why I love Rhode Island so much. And I love Brown University because I could take the bus to the sea. And I took them quite frequently because it kept on demanding that I address my past. And everything I wrote would be some sort of an experimentation of that. And I could never, no matter how often I wrote, I could not erase that particular memory. I haven't been able to erase a lot of my memories since I have really strong emotional memories. I just have really good memories of my childhood. And so I'm addressing them through various memoirs. I collect books of them, and there's so many of them, I just don't know how to tackle them. But I wish I could be at a place where I can depict my existence on that boat without the landscape of defecation and vomit. I want to write a piece that is free from that soilness, but it's hard. And I didn't realize that with Umbilical Hospital there's just so many clitorises and assholes. It's just so many of them. And I don't know why they dominate consciousness. Only that scene on the boat is the reason why some of the work that I produce have repetitions of certain words, because they are. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask you about your relationship to English in that regard too, since Vietnamese is your first language and you often have called Latin your second language and really English is your third language. Is being a writer in English sort of a compromise given the fact that you're of who your readership is, and thus there's this sense of loss and exile in the language? Or is it a place of liberation because of distance, somewhat away from your mother tongue?
Well, I think English is very liberating. I don't think it's stifled me at all. And you're right to say that it gave me a lot of distance. If I wrote anything in Vietnamese, it would be just too... I would just have a meltdown. Vietnamese is a very poetic language. It's incredibly beautiful. It's so tender. Vietnamese, it's like there's certain words that I just love, and I feel like it shouldn't be in a book even because it's so beautiful. I do feel, however, that there's a lot of Vietnamese, the Vietnamese language in my writing. It's just invisible. Like, people said, "Oh, this sentence is strange." I don't think it's strange. It's just, I think it just has a lot of Vietnamese in it, like my Vietnamese past in it. And so it gave that English word or sentence that slant that you don't see because it's not English. It has my, like a somatic system of Vietnamese-ness embedded in between each words of the English word, or between the letters of that English word, that when people read it, it's like, "Oh, your work is really strange and poetic." I don't think it's strange or poetic. I think it's because I live in Vietnam. I was an immigrant. We were refugees. And so there it is. It's just not written in Vietnamese, that's all. So you don't see that reference or that reflection or that domination. But when I read my work, I'm like, this is so Vietnamese. But it doesn't look like Vietnamese. It looks nothing like Vietnamese. It doesn't even sound like Vietnamese. But there is a phantom, I think, sonic volume that is quiet and silence in my work. And I want to say that silence, that invisibility, is very Vietnamese. It tastes and sounds like pho. Some type of banh mi ballet. And when you eat it, you feel like you're eating something very postmodern. But it's traditionally Vietnamese. And I know one of my peers, and a few people have addressed me like this: "V, you're very Vietnamese. A lot of writers are writing ethnic writing. Why aren't you doing it?" I said, "I'm doing it. You just don't see it."
Right.
My work is very ethnic. But it didn't have ethnic word in it. And it didn't have like let's say if I had written A Brief Alphabet of Torture or Fish in Exile, a title like Cá Lưu Vong, that's the Vietnamese translation of Fish in Exile, then it's not ethnic enough. And I think people have a very narrow view of what ethnic writing is, and I just have a very broad outlook on my own writing. And she said, "You should write more ethnic writing." I'm like, "It's ethnic." And I know what she meant. Like, why don't you write like Nam Le,
Mm-hmm.
And why don't you, in some parts of the sympathizers of Viet Thanh Nguyen, And even though he doesn't use diacritical remarks on his manuscript, some of those are Vietnamese. But some of those words were Vietnamese. But I want to say that the diacritical marks that you don't see in my manuscript is the experimental. It has taken place at the experimental, in the experimental form.
Well, speaking of experimental versus mainstream, I'd love to hear a little bit about the relationship of your work to your family reading it, because you've described how you've sometimes have written work that you would consider more mainstream, because in a desire to connect more with your family who might have more difficulty relating to some of your more overtly experimental work. Can you give us some examples of work that you've made with your families as the readership in mind?
Well, Fish in Exile was the original intent. It didn't turn out very well. It didn't turn out very well at all. My sister couldn't even finish the first page of Fish in Exile. And I did a lot of research in Harlequin romance. I read Harlequin romance, and I thought, okay, it shouldn't be that hard. It's in English. It has a particular structure. I'm sure everyone can do it. It's really hard. I've tried. I've tried making my work more accessible for my sisters, and each time I try, my work get weirder and weirder. It's just so, I don't know why they're weird. Maybe because I've tried so many times to write more mainstream material. And I think my memoir is mainstream based, but anytime I say that, people say, this is so weird.
Yeah.
And
well, I think it's true that your so-called mainstream work is still, most people would consider it experimental.
yes, Fish in Exile is experimental. I knew Umbilical Hospital is not mainstream. Right. At least it was very clear between me and my book that there's no delusion here.
Yeah.
And no deception as well. And so I was so glad that I acknowledged that with myself. But like my manuscript that haven't been out in the world, the ones that are ready now, and I'm hoping they will get born soon in the next few years. Those, I think, finger crossed, mainstream.
Yeah.
But the structure may not be mainstream, but the writing, at least it's like you don't have characters named Ethos, a Catholic. They have regular names. Actually, Carol Maso said, why don't you just change the name to like regular? And I changed the whole manuscript. I went through the document and I'm like, I'm going to change it to Ethos as Ethan and Catholic as Catherine, and see how it didn't work.
Yeah.
It just didn't, the names didn't fit with the book, the whole manuscript. But I tried to force Fish in Exile to be what it is not. And it didn't like me very much.
When you did a long time ago, you did an interview with Christopher Higgs at HTML Giant about experimental literature. And you have this really great line that I'm just going to read. Anti-enthusiasts of experimental literature may view experimental writing as an appendix to be removed at some point from the body, a vestigial organ, not a pertinent apparatus of literature. It is, however, a very important organ, perhaps not like the heart, where it circulates mainstream through the bloodstream, but it's an essential organ nonetheless. And I would love to hear, you just mentioned Carol Maso, like you have the most enviable like pantheon of teachers, Talia Field, C.D. Wright, Forrest Gander. And then on the prose side, you had Carol Maso and Brian Evanson. Can you speak a little bit about those experiences for you? I know that you've mentioned Carol Maso talking about the importance of white space, and you mentioned that just now when talking about Vietnamese. Can you maybe share some of the things that still resonate with you with either of those teachers?
Well, I believe experimental writing is very important. I wish it is celebrated more in United States. I know like other countries like France and European countries are more receptive to more experimentalism and tend to celebrate their writers and the writings they do. I value experimental writing, but I also value mainstream writing. I think both have a place in society, and they should be equally valued. I took 5 years out of my life from experimental writing and really honed my craft toward, after the lack of success, after realizing how delusional I was, that Fish in Exile wasn't a Harlequin romance novel that I wanted to be. I actually took 5 year departure from, like, I didn't, like, if an experimental work was born, it was just by, like, default. It was just like I had to get rid of a particular energy, and so they were born. But I really shape and re-hone my craft toward mainstream writing. And so, because I'm so far away from experimental writing, even though I have a lot of manuscripts that are very experimental, I haven't celebrated them. And because of that distance, I feel very distant from my teachers, like Carol Maso and Brian Evanson, because I forced that distance. I've loved quite a few books by Brian Evanson. I try to read all my faculty's writing when I'm at Brown or before I arrive to Brown, so that I'm well informed. It's hard for me to speak. If you've asked me like 5 years ago, I would be able to tell you the energy of experimentalism, and it would have the shape and form that I when I did the Higgs interview. I'm sorry to say that when I abandon something, I completely abandon it. So I think the reason my work is so intense is because I'm willing to annihilate a whole aspect of my existence in order to embrace the new one. And so I put like 100% of my energy in. There's not even like a fiber left of who I was like 5 years ago. And so it's hard for me to speak of Brian Evanson or Carol Maso or Talia Field with the experimentalism in mind.
Sure.
It just, unless I allow myself to go back 5 years into the past and re-abduct myself, and stop estranging myself, I would be able to talk to you. But right now, my consciousness is so embedded in mainstream literature.
Well, maybe you can just indulge one more experimental question.
Okay.
If you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Because I was listening to a panel that you were on, a full stop panel on experimental modes of literary criticism. And in it I discovered, so you're a writer and a poet, novelist, filmmaker, and an interviewer of other writers. But you were also sort of an experimental book reviewer. And you had this project, which sounds kind of as insane as the Sheep Machine project of looking at every frame and then writing it, where you set a goal in 2014 to read 300 books and then write 300 reviews. So tell us about that. Tell us why you wanted to do it. What happened? Did it change something for you, and either as a writer or as a reader, and anything else you wanna add?
I love that project. It's one of my favorite projects that I've engaged in. Originally, I didn't plan on reading 300 books. I don't know how this idea was born, but I had two other friends, and he said if he read 300 books and another friend read 300 books and I read 300 books, we would have like 900 books and 900 reviews. Wouldn't that be so great? And I said, yeah, I'll go for it. And so that year, I'm like, 2014, here I come for $300. Let's go for it. And so to keep us accountable for our own resolution, I start posting them on a blog. And so almost every day, because it's $300, almost every day I post a book. And
This blog, I looked for this blog, but I couldn't find it.
I kept it private. It's still there. It's just no one can access to it. And I also kicked everyone off so no one could have access to it. But it's there. And it has my other 300 film reviews, which I did. But I love it because when I wrote it, I had no one in mind. Like, there was an innocent to it. Like, it's like, I didn't think of like it was going to be published anywhere. I didn't think about anything other than just to fulfill that. And so when I wrote those reviews, I wrote them in a very experimental way. And it completely violated my desire to be mainstream. Like, I was so happy because I kept part of myself for myself. It wasn't like I didn't have that desire to turn my writing into a lucrative condition where I could live off it. I was thinking impractically. And because I wrote those reviews, they were so fun. It was just so incredibly fun to do. I didn't think of an audience. I didn't worry about consequences. And so every review I wrote was just so wild, and they're so fun, and they're so crazy.
Yeah,
And
the panelists were talking about some that sounded super incendiary.
Yeah, they were crazy, and I was so completely honest with myself.
Yeah.
Like, if I hated something, I wrote it. I wasn't trying to be neat and diplomatic. I'm like, this book is the worst poetry collection I've ever read. And I just loved it because the level of honesty was so compelling, and it made me love myself because I wasn't afraid to be myself. And I wrote it and knowing that no one was going to read except for my true friends that was doing it with me, and they were laughing their heads off because I didn't care. There's great power in not caring in that project, and also I didn't think I was going to be able to fulfill it too. I was also laughing my head off because I'm like, this is the first time I won't be able to fulfill what I said I was going to do. And I actually I got lazy. I think like 6 months into it, I read like only like 40 books or something like that. I was like, no one can do that. No one can read 300 books. This is insane. I don't know whose idea was this. And so I sort of tricked myself out of not doing it. I was giving all of the excuses necessary. And I wrote a pen name for that reason. I had a pen name called Align Zai Bum, which means I'm a lazy bum. And I start submitting work out under that name. I submitted to like writing contests under that name, and it got to the point where I knew I was a lazy bum. I was. And 6 months into it, I'm like, but you don't have to be. I told my inner voice, I had that 5-second rule in my head that says, you don't have to be lazy. You can. So I said, well, even though I only have read 40 books in 6 months, let's see how far I can get. Maybe I won't be able to make the 300, but at least I try. It won't hurt to try. So that summer, I sat my butt down. I went to the library. I borrowed like 50 books. And I said, if you read 50 books by the end of the year, at least you have 90. It's, almost 1/3. It's not that bad. The problem with checking out 50 books in one sitting is that I was also scared about having to renew them and going back to the library with them and carrying, it's heavy books, like 50 books is heavy. And so I'm like, I don't want to carry all those books back and then having to renew them and only read 2 books. So I got myself down and I was like, you need to read all of this in 1 week. And
You did it?
I think I read like an obscene amount of books to the point where I didn't have to renew those books. And it got me back onto like 1/3 of the way in this midsummer was not bad. It's doable.
Yeah.
And when I got that that binging out of my system, reading like 2 books a day wasn't so bad. When you have to read like 30 of them within a week or something, it just like it reconditioned me. I'm like, 2 books? That's nothing.
So do you have a book or film recommendation for us?
If you've asked me that earlier, I'd be able to scroll through my blog and tell you. The thing with reading 300 books is that it gives you it forces you not to retain anything because I would document them.
Right.
I was like,
It's out of your brain.
It's out of my brain. Just like the way I wrote Umbilical Hospital. If I documented it in my head, I would have no space for creativity. The same thing with like when you need to make a list of things to do, try not to put it in your head because it takes memory space, real estate on your head, and allows you not to do any work. But I did read a book last year that I really love. I think it was the best book I read, which I didn't read that much. So because I didn't read that much, thus it's the best book I've ever read for that year. And it's The Vegetarian.
I love that book too.
By
Han Kang.
Han Kang. It's a lot of writing and being an Asian American, and we don't get exposed very much to like ethnic writing, writing by ethnic or writing by Asian writers. It's when they do exist, I get so excited because we're representative. Our culture is presented. We're not eating potatoes. We don't see characters eating potatoes and nacho cheese and macaroni and cheese. And so I was just so happy just to see an Asian character eating rice. It was just from a very cultural place. I felt like someone spoke about us, even if it's just a bowl of rice, or just some Asian habits that was rarely get addressed, and the way we exist in this world. And so I was so happy that she wrote that book because I could relate to. I could relate without experiencing what the protagonist was experiencing, and being able to feel like, oh, someone wrote about us, and it's that book is popular, and so it's not something that's esoteric, hidden in a corner, and so in many ways that book's just, I thought it was the best because in so many different ways.
And from you, after Sheep Machine comes out, are the memoirs what we should expect from you next after Sheep Machine?
I wrote a manuscript called An Apiary Concubine that I really liked the process of writing it. So I don't know if I want that to be the next book before my memoir enters the world, and because I had in mind also that book as mainstream, but I think I might be delusional with.
I love the title.
Yeah, An Apiary Concubine.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to whatever you choose to cut from the long fabric to show us next. It was really great having you on the show today, V.
Yeah, thank you, David, for your very insightful and in-depth questions. And your thoughtful and very astute observation of my work. I really appreciate that.
We were talking today to the writer, poet, interviewer, filmmaker, and book reviewer, Khi Nao, the author of Umbilical Hospital and A Brief Alphabet of Torture. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. More of Khi Nao's work can be found at vikinao.com, vikinao.com, as well as the bonus material, both prose and poetry, at the Between the Covers Patreon page, patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating this outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog, A Sa Petite Amie, can be found on iTunes, and Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.